I don't think that it takes too long of a look at the culture in which we live to realize that things have changed. I don't know if I'm Generation X, Y, or Z. I'm a 85 baby. So I remember cord phones and then the transition to cell phones. I watched Captain Kangaroo and Mr. Rogers, but then I watched Power Rangers and Ninja Turtles too. But we look at how our culture, American culture, has shifted over the years. And perhaps it's just being caught up in the moment. I don't think it is, but I'm willing to grant that's a possibility. We see a lot more mental health issues in our world today, don't we, than perhaps what we saw 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. Of course, some of that is better diagnostic tools, being better able to identify those things. But some of it is there are just some things in our culture that have changed. And those changes in our culture have driven some people to more and more dissatisfaction, to the point that in some ways they are experiencing anxiety and depression because of the answers, the supposed answers, that our society has provided. And that's really what we want to talk about this evening. We want to talk about a society, our society, which promises to have all the answers, but oftentimes ends up having all of the wrong answers. And this isn't going to be a study where we just get up here and just down everything in culture. Okay, that's not what we're going to do tonight. We're going to try to be more tactful, and we're going to try to be more targeted than that. I want us to look really at three driving philosophies that are in culture today. And we want to look at these three driving philosophies, kind of two perspectives. We want to look at them simply from a logical perspective, right? Just examine them from a logical perspective, and then, if need be, examine them from a biblical, a spiritual, a scriptural perspective. And so I hope you brought your Bible with you tonight. We're going to start in Acts chapter 5, but to get there, maybe we can just notice some of the shifts, some of the changes, some of the redefinitions that have happened in our culture. And it's not necessarily anything new. Our culture has, over the years, shifted its conceptualization of what an animal is. And I know that this happened at times before 1925, but it was really in 1925 in the Scopes monkey trial in Tennessee, William Jennings Bryan and Clarence Darrow arguing about the teaching of evolution and the idea that man is nothing more than an evolved animal. And to picture humanity, to picture people as just an animal, an evolved form of an animal, but an animal nonetheless, is a shift from how people, humans, individuals were viewed earlier in American society. That's not to say that everybody held that view, but that was a predominant view, and that view has shifted, and we have seen that shift in our society today to where it's almost accepted by the majority. The definition of marriage has shifted in our society and is continuing to shift. Marriage in our culture and our society is no longer defined as a union between a man and a woman, and now we are beginning to see that that union is no longer necessarily in our culture and our society between one man and one woman. Perhaps there are 3 people, 4 people in a union like that. The definition of gender is shifting in our society today, that what one thinks and what one feels is the determining factor rather than something more concrete. And I don't say any of that to point out and say, this is worse than anything else. These are just things that we see in society today. I think we can all agree. Whether we agree or disagree with these things, I think we can agree that our culture, our society has shifted in these ways and is continuing to shift in these ways. And we're embracing and encountering more challenges along these lines, and we're going to have to deal with more things like this, things that we never thought we might have to deal with. Well, how did we get here? How did we get to that point? And like I said, I want us to look at 3 driving philosophies. And there's not going to be a test later, so I don't care that you remember the names of the philosophies or anything like that. And I don't know that we've ever really sat down and put pen to paper and thought through these actual philosophies, but I think we've encountered them. Maybe without putting a specific name to them, a specific title to them, but we've encountered them. The first driving philosophy we'll call radical individualism, which is simply the idea that what an individual wants or what an individual wills is the highest good. Have you seen that in our society? The idea that whatever you want or whatever you will is the highest good, and so pursue that. And in the pursuit of that and in finding that, that is where you will find fulfillment. That's where you'll find peace. That's where you'll find meaning. What an individual wants, what an individual wills, is the highest good. But I want you to just think logically with me about that for a moment. What does that do, for example, to family? Or what does that do to community? Or culture? Or society at large? Suddenly, these organisms that we are a part of are sacrificed. It's no longer about seeking a greater good. It's no longer seeking about the betterment of someone or something else. It all becomes about whom? All becomes about me. It's called radical individualism, but it really ends up being a cloak for nothing more than what? For selfishness. Look at Acts chapter 5. Are you there with me? Just to make a note from a biblical perspective, and I think it's good to do this, I think it's good for us to point out that radical individualism is not what God would call His followers to. While this might be the call of some in society, while this might be the driving force in the lives of some in culture, this is not what God calls His people to. Acts chapter 5, if you're looking there, and at verse 29, God would call on people to ultimately be obedient to Him, that our obedience to Him is of primary importance. Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God rather than men. And the greater context here, many of you probably know, is they're being told not to preach the gospel. But Peter and the apostles are saying, look, God told us to preach the gospel. You, the creation of God, are telling me don't preach the gospel. When what you're telling me and what God is telling me come into conflict, someone has to win the day. And Peter and the apostles say for us, who's going to win the day? It's going to be God. We've got to obey God rather than man. But in case that seems heavy-handed, in case we run and make of that something that God never intended, look at Luke chapter 10. Look at Luke chapter 10. Because the God that calls us to ultimate obedience to Him is the God who expects us to be useful and to be merciful and to be kind and good in whatever sphere of influence we find ourselves. It's not God calls us to ultimately be obedient to Him, and so forget family, forget community, forget society, forget everything. It's all about just me and God. Because God is going to instruct us on how we interact not only with self, but with family and with society and with culture. Luke chapter 10, the story of the Good Samaritan, beginning there in verse 30, but we want to look down here at verse 36, when Jesus gives the conclusion of the parable. That there was a man, an unexpected man, who showed mercy to the man who was beaten and lying on the side of the road. And Jesus says in verse 36, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell in the robber's hands? We're talking about our interactions with our neighbor, our interactions with society at large, our interactions with other people. Who was a neighbor, Jesus said? And the man responded, well, the one who showed mercy to him. And Jesus said what? Go and do the same. That the God who demands ultimate obedience to him is not just expecting a vertical relationship where it's just me and my relationship with God. There's also a horizontal component to this relationship with God. That is how I interact with all of those that God has created. And God expects me to be useful, to be merciful, to be kind, to be good. But that's not what radical individualism says, is it? Radical individualism says what you want, what you desire, that's the highest good in life. We hear this in all sorts of ways, right? YOLO. You only live once, right? So go and do whatever you want to do. Live it up. This is your life. You've only got this time. Do whatever you want to do. And when you do whatever you want to do, it's going to make you happy, and that's the greatest good in this life. But is that true? Think about this from a logical perspective. From a logical perspective, here's the question. What happens when the will of one individual conflicts with my will? There's a big loop around San Antonio, Loop 1604. We live on the north side of San Antonio, so the North Loop. Apparently we moved to San Antonio at just the right time because that's when they decided to do like 18 months of construction on Loop 1604 on the north side. So I've seen nothing but orange barrels on Loop 1604 the entire time I've lived there in San Antonio. It's not as bad as Dallas traffic. It's not as bad as Houston traffic. It's nowhere near as bad as Austin traffic, but it's still traffic, right? And it's aggravating. And when you have those orange barrels out, right, that cuts down that merge lane, right? And there's always that joker who's doing like 45 on the 65-mile-an-hour loop when you're trying to merge in the lane, right? What happens when my will and his will conflict? Radical individualism says, and I know this is an out there example, but it demonstrates the point, right? Radical individualism, if we follow that to its logical extent, he keeps on doing 45, I keep on doing 65, and what's going to happen? We're both going to do what we wanted to do, but we're both going to end up where? Not where we wanted to be. When we pursue radical individualism to its logical end, what happens when the will of one individual conflicts with another? Or consider the greater inconsistency in all of this. That you do whatever makes you happy. You live for you. Okay. The logical consequence of that then is that it's wrong to tell someone that his choices or his beliefs are wrong or immoral. Because as long as you're doing what makes you happy, it's not wrong, is it? Radical individualism says what? That's the meaningful life. Suddenly nothing's wrong. I was refereeing a soccer game. Yeah, another soccer reference, sorry. Just work with me here. I was refereeing a soccer game about 4 years ago in Center, Texas. Booming metropolis of Center, Texas. And get down towards the end of the game. Tie game going into overtime. Still tied in overtime, we're going to penalty kicks. If you've ever seen like a hockey-style shootout at the end of a game, kind of like that. One dad decides that I've done his son wrong. I've cheated his son somehow. Tries to come on the field and start fighting the referees. Has some words that I'm pretty sure would embarrass his mother, that he would never have said in front of his mother. And then tells us just exactly what he wants to do to us. Was he wrong? Was he wrong? Let's hit even closer to home. What about the guy on a college campus that preys on women, sexually assaults them? It's what he wants to do. Is he wrong? Let me answer this very clearly from a biblical perspective. He's wrong. Doesn't matter how she was dressed. Doesn't matter how she was raised. Doesn't matter how he was raised. That behavior's wrong. W-R-O-N-G, wrong. Can radical individualism say that? The logical consequence of radical individualism is that it's wrong to tell someone that his or her choices or beliefs are wrong or immoral. So, logical question, if I don't hold to this worldview, am I wrong? And if I am wrong, could you tell me? Let that sit for a minute and it'll click. But you can't. This worldview, from a biblical perspective, collapses upon itself. But there are some people that don't give any hoot about the Bible. Okay, but even from a logical perspective, this worldview can't support itself. This isn't a worldview worth living for. This isn't a view of the world to take and live my life by. It's going to lead to ruin. It's going to lead to emptiness. It's going to lead to the hardships that we see in our society today. Well, somebody says, okay, no, that's not my worldview. Well, great, I'm glad that's not your worldview, but perhaps you've seen this worldview out in the world. We'll call it relativism. And folks give a lot of definitions to relativism. Let's just define it like this tonight. Relativism is the idea that meaning and truth are relative, so that what is right and true for one person may be wrong and untrue for another person. Meaning and truth are relative. We may not hear someone define their worldview like this, but we might hear statements like this. Maybe you've heard this before. You can't tell me what to do. That's a form of relativism. Or somebody who might say that there is no such thing as absolute truth. Or just there's no such thing as truth. That's a statement that indicates a relativistic worldview. Of course, the Bible, if we're caring about what the Bible has to say, the Bible would argue against this worldview. Jesus would affirm, for example, the nature of truth, the existence of truth. In fact, Jesus will call himself truth, right? John 14 and verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes into the Father except by me. But if we're not approaching this from a biblical perspective, let me submit to you as well that from a logical perspective, relativism struggles to provide meaning and peace, and struggles to even support itself. There are some worldviews that are more philosophical in nature, and so you've got to deal with them more logically. And that's kind of the case with relativism. So let's just ask ourselves, can relativism, easy for me to say, sustain itself? Is relativism the answer? Is the answer just to say, well, that's your truth, but not my truth, and let's just live by our truth? Well, I mean, that might sound good on a radio talk show. That might sound good when the talking heads on TV are going at it. That doesn't mean anything. You live your truth, I'll live my truth, and we'll just live our truth. What is our truth? We haven't agreed on anything yet, have we? Somebody says there's no such thing as absolute truth. There's no such thing as truth. Simple question. Is that true? That's a good way to get slugged, probably. But that's a legitimate question, isn't it? Somebody says there's no truth. Is that true? That's a truth statement. To say that there is no truth is affirming an absolute, is in itself a truth statement. Even if you're saying truth does not exist, that's a form of a truth statement. We're suddenly in all sorts of logical limbo here. If we're going to say that there is no truth, is that a true statement? Somebody's going to say, you can't tell me what to do. What are you doing? Because it sure seems like you're doing just exactly what you're saying you can't do. And I would just have you notice the strong relationship that seems to be there between relativism and radical individualism. It's almost like radical individualism takes me and makes me what? Truth. The determiner and arbiter of truth. A lot of problems with that, right? Anyone remember your junior high days? Anyone that's out of your junior high days remember your junior high days? Yeah? You remember that kid in junior high that you were just absolutely in love with and you knew you were going to marry them? You ever Facebook stalked them lately? Aren't you glad you didn't marry them? I know I am, right? We think we've got it all figured out. We can make some poor choices, can't we? I'm not the truth. I'm not the standard. I'm not the arbiter. And I'm absolutely okay with that. Because I'm not equipped to be that. I'm not divine. I don't have all knowledge. I don't have all power. I submit to you ultimately what you see with relativism and radical individualism is at the end of the day it's lawlessness. There's no standard. There's no truth. At the end of the day, the logical conclusion is lawlessness. You do whatever you want to do. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. You can't tell me what to do, even though you're telling me what to do and it didn't work. But lawlessness. Not a lot of hope in that worldview, is there? Sounds good on the surface, doesn't it? YOLO, do whatever you want to do, live your life now, be who you want to be. Sounds good. Doesn't deliver a whole lot, does it? In fact, that's the very thing in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 4 we as Christians are called away from. What communion has light with darkness? Lawlessness with righteousness. We can't be lawless people and be followers of God. There's one other big driving idea, philosophy, worldview. And we'll just call it the sexual revolution. If it feels good, do it. This is what our media is absolutely consumed with, isn't it? This is what we are fed day in and day out. That sexual expression, sexual freedom, that is the peak of man's existence. And so if it feels good, do it. Your body is your own. You are to enjoy your body in whatever way you deem is best. Again, radical individualism, relativism, they're all in this together. Just if we could for a moment, from a biblical perspective, I think we can notice this is not the kind of view that God would call us to. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 with me. If we're concerned about what God has to say to us, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting in verse 18, the reality is this is not the worldview for somebody who's concerned about serving God or for somebody who's striving to hold a biblical worldview. Under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18, flee sexual immorality. Every other sin that a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? For you have been bought with a price, therefore glorify God in your body. So if we're concerned about the biblical perspective, if we're concerned about serving God, this is not the worldview for me. But if the Bible doesn't really do it for me, let's go through and examine this a little bit more. This is what our media presents to us, that sexual freedom is the ultimate in personal fulfillment. But is that true? That is the presentation. Sex sells, and it is everywhere. From our clothing to what we're going to eat, to what we're going to drink, to what we're going to watch, what music we're going to listen to, it's all delivered to us in terms of sex appeal, often, isn't it? And it's this subtle message that is being reinforced over and over and over again that sexual activity is the ultimate in human fulfillment. But is that true? Is that true? What happens if I've been traumatized by sexual activity? That example we looked at earlier. But the other side of the coin, the person who's been sexually assaulted. Oftentimes for that person, sexual activity is no longer the ultimate in human fulfillment. What if that sort of fulfillment has been taken away from me by the ungodly acts of somebody else? What does this worldview offer me? Or what if, due to age or due to injury, sexual activity just isn't a possibility? What do I do with my life then? What does this worldview offer me? In addressing a similar subject, Richard Dawkins, in his work, River Out of Eden, said this, that there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. That sounds a lot like relativism, doesn't it? Nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's, note this, it is every living object's sole reason for being. So let me ask again, in light of what Mr. Dawkins says here. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Is it really? What about the people that have been traumatized by sexual activity? What about the people that can't engage in sexual activity? What about the people, we all know them, maybe us, who can't propagate DNA, who for one reason or another can't have children? You take Mr. Dawkins' worldview that is expressed here. And if you don't trust me, you go read River Out of Eden and you read this chapter and you tell me if I'm wrong, if I'm taking him out of context. I don't think I am. What does his worldview offer for the person that can't have a child? Nothing. Nothing. Could it be that worldviews like this that leave so many out in the dark and out in the cold? Could it be that it's these worldviews that are contributing to so much anxiety and depression and aimlessness and feelings of unfulfillment? Could it possibly be these ideas? Because we've identified in each of these that God in His Word would call us to something completely different. That God in His Word exposes all of these ideologies for what they are. But in a society, in a culture today that has relegated God to the back burner and embraced all of these other philosophies, is it time for us to consider that maybe, just maybe, the modern philosophies that have been foisted upon us aren't doing what they've claimed to do and aren't providing what they've claimed to provide? Is absolute sexual license the answer? If you don't want the Bible, let's just look at what science is telling us. And yes, we're in a church. And yes, we're going to talk about science. And Christians can talk about science and not be scared about it, right? Here's the evidence that's out there. Females who were sexually active before marriage tend to be more depressed than abstinent girls by a rate of 3 to 1. Just for your consideration. Consider this from the book Hooked, published in 2008. Neurologists have identified a link between previous sexual partners and the ability, or lack thereof, to find sexual satisfaction in future relationships. That is, you read that book and their work in more depth, and the numbers begin to tell that the more sexual partners I've had in my past, the less likely I am and the less able I am to find satisfaction in future relationships. It's almost as if the sexual revolution has sold us a lie. Which is not a shock, because you talk to too many people from the 60s and the 70s who lived through that in a thriving way in the U.S. culture, are telling that very story as they age. This is Dr. Sandhya Ramarkar. In her work, The Relationship Between Multiple Sexual Partners and Anxiety, Depression, and Substance Dependence Disorders, a cohort study, she said this. The study established a strong association between number of sex partners and later substance disorder, especially for women, which persisted beyond prior substance use and mental health problems more generally. That is, those that had more sexual partners tended in the future to have more substance use issues to a greater degree than what they did in the past, and tended to have more mental health issues than what they had in the past. That is kind of in just the investigative part of the study. As she comes over here and she gets to the so what part of the study, which is the part I was really interested in. Here's what she said as she was talking about the ramifications of her study. She said, the fourth intriguing possibility is that it is something about having multiple sex partners. We're talking about the Tinder generation, right? Swipe left, swipe right. Some of you understand that. Some of you like swipe right. Just don't worry about it. Some of you get that, and you're who I'm talking to. The fourth intriguing possibility is that it is something about having multiple sex partners itself, which puts people at risk of substance disorder. For instance, it may be due to the impersonal nature of such relationships. Is that the hookup culture or what? The impersonal nature of such relationships, or it might be that multiple failed relationships create anxiety about initiating new relationships. Self-medication with substances may be one way of dealing with this interpersonal anxiety. Specifically, feelings of loneliness and hopelessness are related to substance use, and drinking alcohol to cope with negative emotions has been shown to result in alcohol problems. Shocked face right here, right? Did you catch that? Drinking alcohol to cope with negative emotions has been shown to result in alcohol problems. Statements you never thought a scientist would have to write out for people to read and understand. Shock of all shocks, if you're drinking alcohol to cope, you're probably going to end up with what? An alcohol problem. But again, this is the science. Sexual revolution hadn't lived up to all it's promised, has it? The idea that it's my body, I'm going to do with it what I want. It's for me to enjoy. Whatever I find, that's what I'm going to do, and that's where I'm going to find peace. God in His Word says that's not the way to go. Logic says that's not the way to go. Science says that's not the way to go. 3 driving world philosophies, and each and every one of them fail to deliver what they promise. If we're putting our hope and our confidence and our trust and our meaning in this world, it's going to fail. Radical individualism can't support itself, because what happens when someone else's worldview conflicts with mine? Relativism denies itself and leads to lawlessness. because you can't absolutely affirm that there is no truth. It is a logical impossibility. Relativism doesn't even get off the ground. But if we're looking for alternatives, in John chapter 8, God offers us light and truth in Jesus Christ. John chapter 8, we've already looked at John 14 and verse 6, where Jesus affirms that He is truth. But in John chapter 8 and in verse 12, one of these great I am statements in the book of John, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. There is truth. There is meaning. There is something real out there. But relativism won't lead us to find it. The sexual revolution won't lead us to find it. Radical individualism won't lead us to find it. But Jesus will lead us to it. We can find it in Jesus. The sexual revolution is fleeting and empty. Science is steadily confirming the destructive results of absolute sexual license. The hookup culture has failed. The sexual revolution is fleeting and it's empty. The wise man Solomon would remind us that sex finds meaning ultimately in marriage, which is where Jesus will place it in Matthew chapter 19, where the Holy Spirit will remind us it belongs in Hebrews 13 and verse 4. Marriage is honorable among all, and the bed is undefiled. Let me ask you this. What real peace does the sexual revolution give? What real and lasting and meaningful peace does it give? And the answer is it doesn't. So what can I do? What can I do? Here's what I can do. I can emphasize the concept of truth to the next generation. Those of us who have lived through some of this, those of us who have some experiences, those of us who have made the wrong decisions, I know I can't be the only one here tonight who has. You know what we do? We talk to the younger generation. And we don't glorify the mistakes that we made, but we let them know that we made the mistakes and that there were better choices out there to make, and we should have made them, and we want you to make them so that you don't go down the same path that we went down. I can emphasize the concept of truth to the next generation. I can talk about man being the deliberate creation of God, and that by affirming this principle, by affirming the reality that man, that humanity is the deliberate creation of God, that is the worldview, listen, that is the worldview that instills within everybody value and dignity and worth. Each and every one of us, sinner or saint, being the deliberate creation of God, means we are all beings of value and dignity and worth. You don't get that with an evolutionary worldview, a macro-evolutionary worldview. But this is the biblical worldview. Man is the deliberate creation of God. I can remind coming generations that marriage is reserved for male and female, and that is where God has placed the sexual relationship, and He's placed it there for our good. All of those studies that we looked at, we're talking about the hookup culture outside of marriage, right? But study after study is going to affirm how marriages grow and sustain themselves and provide meaning and fulfillment when you've got that dedication, when you've got that physical intimacy, when you've got trust. What else can I do? I can work to instill godly values in those who are around me. Like Jesus did in John chapter 8, I can lovingly respond to sinners while still refusing to compromise on matters of truth. Like we talked about with Jesus and Zacchaeus Sunday morning, right? I can work to instill godly values in those who are around me. I can mirror Christ in my life, right? That you, 1 Peter 2, should follow in His steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found within His mouth, who when He was reviled did not revile in return, but committed himself to Him who judges righteously. I can walk in the steps of Jesus. I can let my light so shine before men that they would see my good works and glorify God. That's what I can do. And you know what else I can do? I can make God and His Word a deliberate part of my life, not an accidental part of my life. We came back from Christmas one time when we lived at Gladewater. We pulled into our garage. We had gutters going around the outside of our house. Audrey says, "Oh, look, we have a tree growing in our gutters." You ever had a tree grow in your gutters? I did. Do you know how a tree grows in your gutters? From never, ever cleaning out your gutters. Especially when you've got a big oak tree right beside it. We get home, there's a small oak tree growing out of our gutters. Accidentally growing a tree. I think some of us sometimes, that's how we view Christianity. We're just going to hope that somewhere along the way it's going to take root and grow. That's not the way to grow a tree, and it's not the way to grow a life. I got to make God and His Word a deliberate part of my life. Make a conscious decision. Open my Bible. Read it every now and then. Pray consistently. Assemble with the saints. That's what John said, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life, it's not from the Father, but it's from the world. And the world is passing away. If we live for this world, we do so at our peril. The world is passing away, and also its lust, but the one who does the will of God will live forever. That's what we're calling you to tonight. Find the will of God and do it. Maybe as you're here tonight, you look at your life, you see that you're outside of a relationship with the Lord, and you want that to change. We're ready to help you make that change this evening. If you're willing to confess Jesus as your Lord and turn from your sins, we'll immerse you in water for the forgiveness of your sins, and you can raise up and live a new life. Maybe as a Christian, you look at your life and you haven't been living as you should. Maybe you've been living more for this world and less for the Lord, and you're ready to change. We want to pray with you and pray for you and encourage you and help you. Maybe you don't know what you need to do yet, but you're convinced you need to do something, and you want to change. We're happy to study with you. We're happy to talk with you. We're happy to do whatever we can. If you'd simply let us know by coming while we stand and while we sing.